So our next talk is from Simon White from Munich, and he'll be talking about Planck and wide-field galaxy surveys.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. So I wasn't completely sure what I was expected to talk about in this talk, in this session, but I decided to talk about Planck results on the relation by comparison with wide-field galaxy surveys. Let's see, that works, and that works, good. So Planck, of course, is an all-sky experiment with better sensitivity in a number of ways than anything we've had before, and greater wavelength coverage. So in comparing it with wide field surveys, you can take advantage of the fact that when you have a large overlap and many objects, so for example, you of course find very rare objects, but you also find large numbers of more typical objects. And this allows you to try and get high signal-to-noise detections of the average properties of objects where individually you have no chance to see something. And this allows us in principle to push down to much lower signal-to-noise and learn new things just because of the very large number of objects that you find. So a number of examples of this. So one of the newest things in Planck was the map of the mass of the universe through lensing. And of course this covers the whole sky. Now the signal to noise in the map with Planck resolution is not very good. It's about a half. But when you combine with other objects, then it goes up dramatically. And we saw some examples of this in Karim's talk, where he showed, Karim Benabed, that is, earlier in the conference, where he showed results from cross-correlating the Planck map with samples of quasars, samples of galaxy clusters, samples of galaxies, finding cross-correlation signals with amplitudes up to 20 sigma. So this already is very useful. For example, if you have a large survey and you want to know the bias of your population relative to the mass, you can measure that at many sigma. And you know you're measuring it relative to the mass because here we have the advantage compared to other lensing surveys that we know what the distribution of the source is. There's no geometric uncertainty from the source distribution. So this is already something which is very useful, but I'm not going to speak more about it now. Another thing which we have in Planck, which wasn't possible before, is an all-sky map of the baryon distribution throughout the universe through the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect, which of course is the pressure line integral. So we can now, if we cross-correlate this, we can find the hot gas associated with objects. The most obvious case, of course, is the clusters, where you can see them individually. By cross-correlation, you can also find hot gas associated with lower mass objects, and that I'll talk about later. And you can think about other things, which, to my knowledge, haven't been done very much yet, but could still be interesting. By cross-correlating the high frequencies, then we will get, for average populations of galaxies, you can stack tens or even hundreds of thousands of objects. You can get the mean dust emission of individual classes of objects from the high-frequency channels and the mean radio emission from the low-frequency channels. So I'm not aware of people doing this yet, but I think this is definitely something which we should be trying. So what I want to concentrate on today are results from stacking the Y maps. It's not exactly how we do it, but that's the easiest way to think about it, around objects defined using the SDSS, because that's the largest optical survey we currently have available. And I'm going to talk about two things. One is what you learn from this about cluster scaling relations for optically selected clusters. And this, I think, is the largest discrepancy we've heard about in the Planck data during the conference is the apparent discrepancy from the results found using a conventional analysis of the clusters and the results found from looking at the microwave background itself. And the issue is, where is this coming from? And I think looking at some of the results you get from the optically selected clusters suggests some of the possible sources for this discrepancy. So I want to spend a bit of time on that. And the other thing I want to do is show you what you get by stacking very large numbers of objects to see what we can say about the missing baryons in the low-density universe, whether we can find the hot baryons associated with objects smaller than galaxy clusters. And as you can see, as you will see, this is in fact possible. So if you have a complete galaxy survey, you can see all the galaxies in your volume. You would think this was the ideal way to find galaxy clusters, because a galaxy cluster is a cluster of galaxies. Actually, in the community, this is generally not the view, at least among non-optical astronomers at the moment. Nevertheless, you do get very large numbers of clusters if you analyze optical surveys, and in the Sloan survey in DR5, there's a catalog known as the Max BCG catalog, which was made by the Sloan collaboration themselves, based on red sequence galaxies, which contains 14,000 galaxy clusters over 7,500 square degrees with richnesses above 10. So that's 10 relatively bright red galaxies near the center of the cluster is what this number means. That's supposed to be a measure of the number of galaxies in the cluster, which is supposed to be a measure in some way of its mass. So you can just take this catalog. Of course, you know for each object its redshift and the number of galaxies from the Sloan and its position. You just stack the Y maps at those positions, and this is the result as a function of richness. So these are just bins in the richness, and there are, I think, well over nearly 2,000 clusters in this first bin here. So you get amazing signal. Look at the error bars here. These are bootstrap error bars. They include some of the systematics. They're well under 10%, and it's a nice power law. So you certainly get results where the statistical significance is very high. So you've measured something very well. Then you have to figure out what it is you've actually measured. So for these same bins, you have 1,000 clusters here, you can stack the lensing data. So you can measure a mass for these same bins of objects and get an average mass. And you can get that very well. So you can get a relation between the richness and the mass. And then the X-ray astronomers have made very detailed studies of clusters which allow them for a given mass to predict what the X-ray properties should be, what the Y properties should be, and so then to predict for a given mass what the Y properties would be. So you can take this, you can use the lensing measurements to get from each of these bins to get a mass. You can use the X-ray properties, which show, as Monique Arnaud showed us earlier in the week, very systematic properties with apparently very little scatter to get the Y, and then you just plot them on top, and this is the result you get. And again, the lensing results normally also have very small errors because you've stacked so many objects. And the result you can see is not so encouraging. This is a factor of 2. So you're off in the Y signal by a factor of 2, or if you read it this way, this is about 30 or 40% in the richness. And this is way outside the error bars. So this was one of the first results in the early release for Planck. So everyone was stuck thinking, well, what's going on? So the lensing results used here were the first lensing results from the Sloan collaboration themselves, published in 2007. So one question is, well, are there issues with the lensing? And people went back to look at this and identified a number of issues to do with whether the source distributions for the objects had been properly identified, whether been properly measured, issues to do with whether the centers of the clusters have been properly found, and so on. And tried again, and this was the result. This is the improved calibration. This is now a factor of 5 for the low mass objects, and still more than a factor of 2 the high mass objects. So if you read it this way, it's now a factor of 2 in richness, which is roughly mass in some sense, and still a significant one up here. So we have a serious problem that what you get taking the optical clusters and going through what seems like a straightforward exercise doesn't agree with what you thought you knew from the detailed X-ray studies. So the question is, what do we do about this? So one thing you can do is take these clusters. There are about, as I said, about 14,000 clusters here. If you go to the X-ray catalogs, there are a couple of hundred of them which are actually well measured in X-ray catalogs. So it's not a lot, but at least it's a couple of hundred. So you can just plot the relation for the couple and do the stacking for those which are also in the X-ray catalogs. And this is the result. So let me flip backwards and forwards, because this right-hand panel, what you'll see is the prediction is the same, because we're going through the same. So the prediction doesn't change, but look what happens to the red points, which are the actual data. So now if you take the couple of hundred which are actually in the X-ray catalogs, error bars have gone up, of course, but it basically works. So what this means is that a given richness, If you pick the ones which are in X-ray catalogues, you get something which agrees with your prediction, which was based on Monique's universal profile, based essentially on X-ray data. But if you take all the clusters, you get something which down here, it's a factor of whatever it was, 5 or 6 lower. And even up at the high mass end, it's lower by almost a factor of 2. So now, what's going on? Right? So apparently the X-ray, so what this means is that in the max BCG catalog, the clusters which are also in the X-ray catalogs clearly have a larger Y signal than the ones which don't. So they clearly will have a larger X-ray signal because at any given richness, the X-ray catalogs will preferentially include the things with a large X-ray signal, but they also include the things with the largest SZ signal. Maybe that's not so surprising because both measurements are actually looking at the gas in the clusters, so you may well think these things go together. So one exercise you can do is you can go back to the full sample, all the 14,000, and stack the X-ray emission as well, so you can find out the average X-ray emission of the typical cluster, and then plot that against what we had before, which was the average Y. And now this is what you get. So you can see there's 4,000 clusters in this first bin down here. And now it fits miraculously back on the relation which was predicted just from the X-ray clusters. So the relation between the two observables which depend on the hot gas is actually the same for the X-ray selected sample as for the whole sample. So what's happened is that a bias, whatever it is, I'm calling it Malmquist bias, has actually shifted the points along the relation. So we still haven't fully caught up with what the problem is. So I think this is about as much as I want to say about this problem. It's still not fully sorted out. But what you can see is cluster selection by optical X-ray and SE methods leads to samples, sets of clusters with systematically different properties. And we already saw this in Monique's talk herself, where she showed that the clusters which were found by Planck and which were not in X-ray catalogues were systematically different from the ones which were found by Planck which were in the X-ray catalogues, in the sense they tended to be more irregular and have somewhat lower X-ray luminosities. So even though these two variables do, to a large extent, vary together, they don't vary exactly, and this already leads to differences between X-ray selected catalogues and SZ selected catalogues. And what we can see with the max BCG samples, if you go to optically selected catalogues, these differences become much larger, the scatter gets much bigger. What you also see is these differences shift the scaling relations by factors which are, a factor of 4 in one case and a factor of order 2 in the mean. So you better understand exactly which scaling relation you should apply for the samples you're actually using. So I think a lot of the issue we have to worry about why we have this discrepancy is whether the calibration is actually being done on the appropriate samples. The ones which I think when we predict abundances, we were predicting the number of objects as a function of their mass in a particular volume. So these are volume limited samples. So are our calibrations actually appropriate? And could this be part of the effect? To remind you, don't pay any attention to the points here, which are not relevant, but this turned out to this is a just mass cluster mass function around what we're worrying about. We have a factor offset, which is a bit more than a factor of 2 vertically between, let's say this is the abundance of clusters which we measure, and this is what will be predicted by the scaling relations we're currently using for the microwave background cosmology, which is about a factor of 2.5 higher. That's what we've been hearing. If you read it horizontally, this is actually incorrect. I misread my plot. This should be nearly 30%. But this green arrow is 30%. So it's 2.5 in this direction, but 25 to 30% in this direction. So if you're worried about it in terms of the offset, it's 25 to 30% in mass, or in Y, this would correspond to about 40%. Right? Again, this number is too low. So could we be off in the normalization of our Y relations by 40%? Well, as I showed you for the optical clusters, we had factors of 4. Now, they're undoubtedly more irregular than the cluster sets we're using, but the question is whether these effects could still be at the level that's needed to reconcile these things. So let me move on to the second part, which I spent too long on that, which is stacking just around galaxies. If you stack around galaxies without selecting them, you get a mixture of things, because some galaxies live at the middle of a dark matter halo and others are member galaxies in a cluster. So it turns out the things simplify if you stack around galaxies which are defined to be the locally brightest galaxies in their structures. So this is just showing if you take all the galaxies in the Sloan final release of the Sloan 2 in the spectroscopic sample, far enough away that you know their distance well, and you require they have no companion who's brighter than they are within 1 megaparsec and 1,000 kilometers a second, then you get large numbers of objects. So this is bins in mass. So there's 10 to the 11.4 to 11.7, 10 to 11.1 to 11.4. You can see you get here 50,000 galaxies before you make the selection. After you make the selection, you still have 45,000 galaxies, which are the locally brightest galaxy. Okay? And their colors and their redshift distributions are very similar to the rest of the sample. So what I'm going to show you results from stacking around these objects. So the idea is if you're the brightest galaxy around, you're probably sitting at the center of the halo, just like a CD galaxy sits at the center of its cluster. To check whether that's the case, you have to do some modeling. So here you have to put your cosmology in. So here I'm going to use this particular simulation of the galaxy population, which fits the mass function of galaxies and their clustering very well, and observe it in exactly the same way as the real survey, so to try and figure out what you pick up if you make these selections. So this is now the mass of the galaxy, the stellar mass, and this is the fraction of them which are actually now in the simulation the central galaxy of their dark matter object. So you make no selection, then at the high mass end, they're still always the central galaxy, but at the low mass end, only roughly half of them are the dominant galaxy in their halo. When you make this selection to be locally brightest, then always more than 83% of them are in fact the central galaxies of their halos. But if you look at the relation between the mass of the halo you're sitting in and the mass of stars in the galaxy, even for these objects, you can see here, in fact we'll only be interested in the right-hand side of this plot, there's still a huge range, right? From here to here is a factor of 300. That's because there are still a few objects which are satellite galaxies, and it turns out that blue galaxies like spirals and red galaxies like ellipticals actually live in different mass halos. And so if you take the median mass at a given stellar halo mass, you're down here, you can see there's a factor of almost 2. So you have to be very careful about what you mean about the mass associated with the dark matter mass associated with the stellar mass. But what you can do is use these simulations to calibrate this. So here are the actual Planck data when you do the stacking. So this is just taking the Y map and stacking them, and there are roughly 40,000 galaxies stacked here. So this is 2 degrees by 2 degrees, stacking the Y maps of 40,000 galaxies. You can see the noise by looking at the edges here, and it's about 10 microkelvin. And this is galactic latitude. There's no gradient, so there's no signal from dust in here. And you can see there appears to be an excess at the center. This is the Planck beam. And as you go to more massive objects, this is just about 10 to the 11 solar masses here with several times 10 to the 11 solar masses of stars. You can see there's a very significant signal. But you see something even down to this mass. So if you just plot these results directly, this is the observation, this is the mean Y signal, this is the mass, this is the stellar mass, you clearly see something down to about 10 to the 11 solar masses of stars, which is about the mass of M31, twice the mass of the Milky Way. So we're apparently seeing signal in halos down to something like the halo of M31. Notice that this is essentially a power law. So now we want to compare this with other data. We have to get away from the stellar mass to something which we can calibrate, which is, for example, the dark matter mass. So this you can do by using the simulation I showed you. So since I'm running behind, I won't go through the detail, but you have to be very careful how you do this because of the wide mass distribution I was telling you. So effectively, we mock up the whole process and then figure out what average dark matter mass we think corresponds to each stellar mass bin. And then we use that to plot this axis. So the observational data here are the same as before. And this is now a mock catalog where we've adjusted the relation between the Y signal and the halo mass in order to get a fit. And so you see we've taken Y to be a power law in the halo mass with a normalization and adjusted the normalization of the power law so that the simulated result lies right on top of the data. Now when you do this, you get a very interesting result, which is the scaling you get is exactly the self-similar scaling you predict by the simplest possible model, where each halo has its own fraction of baryons distributed in the same way as the dark matter. And the normalization corresponds more or less to the cosmic baryon fraction. So this is essentially the simplest possible answer, fits. And if you make a comparison now by translating into the mass, this is the next to last slide, so into the halo mass, so these are the same points, but now just translated to a halo mass axis here, using the mean mass before. We can now compare with the cluster results, where the cluster masses have been estimated by the normal X-ray techniques. And you can see now they appear to agree very nicely. There's about a 20% offset, which is about the order you predict for the residual Malmquist bias in the cluster results from the fact they're X-ray selected, but now at a given mass. And at a given mass, the scatter is smaller, so the Malmquist bias is much smaller than the numbers I was talking about earlier, where they were richness selected. And the 20% looks consistent. So now we seem to have a scaling relation where you can take this power law and extrapolate all the way down to here. So this is curious because it looks as though the results we're used to for clusters, where you can see the baryons, unlike in the X-rays where you don't see the baryons in the X-rays in low mass objects, here it extrapolates down with no obvious break. So it appears that in the Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect, you can see the baryons around the lower mass objects where you can't see them in the X-rays. And the results, although the error bars get big, are consistent with the simplest possible extrapolation. So if you just integrate down and ask, well, what fraction have we seen? Down to this limit, you've seen roughly 10% of all the baryons in the local universe. Down to this limit, you've seen roughly a quarter. So we're making progress to finding the baryons locally, although still 3/4 of them missing. So to conclude, the cluster scaling relations and their evolution are the critical factor in actually using the cluster counts to make cosmology, as Marian Duspies emphasized in his own talk when he was talking about the Planck results on this. And the scatter, it's clear that the scatter in the proxies that we're using can interact with the sample selection to produce biased results. So there's been quite a lot of work to try and control this. So we're confident that the biases are much smaller than the ones I was showing you for the optical samples. I'm not sure we yet have it down so we're sure that they're much smaller than the difference between the CMB results and the cluster results. So here there's lots of debate inside the team at the moment. I think we don't have a consensus view. So that's my personal view rather than the view of the Planck collaboration. If you adopt a cosmology, as I did by using the model, then of course you can turn the thing around and try and use the results to look at the physics of the hot medium, and then the stacking allows you to go to much lower masses than you could before. And then we have the interesting result that we see an SC signal down to things which are only slightly more massive than the Milky Way's own halo, and there's no obvious break in the scaling relation. So it looks as though the baryons are there somewhere. They're hot, otherwise they wouldn't show up in the SC set, but they're apparently not concentrated enough to produce the X-rays. So they've been pushed out a bit from the centers. So obviously, if you read my abstract, you'll see I suggested that we'd show some results about evolution in this relation, because in principle now we can stack galaxy samples at higher redshift and actually look for the revolution of this. This is, as most things, turned out to be more complicated than we were hoping, and so in fact we don't yet have results that we could present. So, but in principle, you can use this technique out to much higher redshifts. As for things like the lensing techniques, where we saw a result for the lensing detected at redshift 1.5, and used the Planck to go out to much larger redshifts. So I think clearly this will happen in the future, but we're not there yet. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to Simon. Questions? Gianfranco?
Simon, concerning the possible problems with the cluster scaling relations, may it be that in part the problem is due to some ambiguities in the definition of optical clusters? I mean, there may be interlopers that can contaminate your definition of a cluster.
Of course, but a cluster of galaxies is a cluster of galaxies, and the definition used by the optical people is a large number of galaxies in a small region of space. So if your definition of a cluster is it should have a nice symmetric distribution of hot gas, then that may not be the same thing. But the issue is when we predict the abundance, which of these two is the thing which is in the mass function we're using to make cosmological results. So I think we have to somehow take the cosmology that we're using and skip this thing and somehow make the predictions directly for the abundance of the observable objects in terms of their observable properties, so be it X-ray luminosity or number counts of galaxies.
Okay, time for one more question. Yeah, Jim?
Simon, I think your elegant mass-Y relation implies a temperature-mass relation, which can be compared to virial temperatures.
Yeah, that essentially was the assumption that was behind it. So this was assuming the temperature follows the virial temperature.
I see.
Okay, well, let's thank Simon again.